Chapter 1. Man on a Noose. A hush had fallen over the courtroom. The air smelled of old varnish and faintly of brass polish, but neither could mask the stench of sweat and fear that had settled in the room. It was spring in North Carolina, 1998, of our era. The heavy, humid air outside had been locked out by the regimented sterility of Fort Bragg's military courtroom. The dim fluorescent lighting cast a glow over the mahogany panels and the neatly pressed uniforms of those in attendance. At the front of the courtroom, Brigadier General Nolan, the Fort Bragg judge advocate, sat tall behind the raised bench. His clean-shaven square jaw was clenched so hard it was a miracle it had not shattered. His uniform, crisp and adorned with his rank insignia, only added to the steel in his eyes. He had presided over dozens of court-martial and had seen soldiers, both old and young, rise and fall. Each case was its tragedy. Everyone had their own crimes to pay for, and if there was one thing they all had in common, it was that the law made exception for none. To his right, a jury of non-commissioned officers sat in silence, their expressions carefully measured. Some of them had spent their careers leading men like Specialist Shane Alexander into the field. Today, they would decide his fate. At the defense table, Shane Alexander stood rigidly beside his attorney, Major William Davis. The young specialist had barely moved since entering the courtroom that morning. His lean, athletic frame was locked into a posture of attention, though his fists remained clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. His dress uniform, a deep green Class A with neatly pinned ribbons, was flawless. Every inch of fabric pressed, every brass button polished. But none of it would matter, for today's inspection was something else entirely. His face, once youthful and full of life, had been drained of all color, fair skin looking almost ghostly. His dark brown hair was clipped short in regulation style, his sharp features betraying nothing, but his eyes, gray like an overcast sky, were set ahead, unblinking. Behind him, his parents, Tim and Mary Alexander, sat on the cold wooden bench. Tim, a man who had built his life with his hands, set his mouth so hard that the muscle in his cheek twitched. His work-worn fingers, thick from years of labor, rested on his knees, white-knuckled. Mary sat beside him, her back unnaturally straight, as though her spine alone was holding her together. Her hands, small and delicate, twisted the edge of a white handkerchief in her lap, a futile attempt to contain the trembling that threatened to overtake her. She had dressed with care that morning, a soft blue dress, simple pearl earrings, but none of it mattered now. The only thing she saw was her son, standing alone before the judgment of the military he had idolized since childhood. Across the room, the prosecution table remained impassive. Captain Raymond Lindstrom, a man known for his unshakable demeanor, sat with his hands folded neatly before him. His uniform, as immaculate as the others, bore the combat infantryman badge and an assortment of ribbons, each a silent proof of a career forged in discipline and adherence to military law. Silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. Then at last Brigadier General Nolan spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" His gaze swept over the seated officers before settling on the ranking juror, Sergeant Bassey. The sergeant, a seasoned soldier with broad shoulders and the stern countenance of a man who had seen too much, stood with the rigid discipline which came from having spent years in uniform. His eyes flicked momentarily to Shane, then back to the judge. "We have, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. As the words left his mouth, the weight of inevitability settled over the room like a crushing force. Tim and Mary Alexander did not move. They only stared at their son. Mary's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Tim, usually a man of few words, sat frozen, his weathered hands pressing into the wooden bench as if anchoring himself in place. Shane had always wanted to be a soldier. From the time he was a boy, he had spoken of service, of duty, of making a difference. It was all he had ever dreamed of. And now the army was about to cast him aside. Brigadier General Nolan let the silence hang for a moment longer before his voice rang out again, steady as ever. The defendant will rise. Major Davis shifted first, adjusting the papers in front of him before standing, his movements calm, practiced. Shane followed, his limbs stiff as though he were held together by sheer force of will alone. Across the aisle, a reporter from the Fayetteville Observer scribbled furiously into his notebook, barely looking up as he documented the moment. The gallery was packed. Other soldiers, members of the press, a few civilians who had come to witness the trial's conclusion. Some leaned forward slightly, as if being closer might reveal some unspoken truth in the young soldier's expression. Judge Nolan's voice cut through the room, sharp as a blade. "What say you?" Sergeant Bassey's fingers tightened around the charge sheet in his hands. He did not hesitate as he read, his voice unwavering, though the words themselves seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. On the charge of violation of Article 118, we find Specialist Alexander guilty. A breath caught somewhere in the courtroom. Murder. Shane's lips twitched into a scowl, his brows furrowed despite his attempts to keep any sort of feelings from showing. His father exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his knee. On the charge of violating Article 92, we find Specialist Alexander guilty. Failure to obey a lawful order. Mary's lips trembled. The handkerchief in her hands was twisted beyond recognition. On the charge of violating Article 134, we find Specialist Alexander guilty, bringing discredit upon the service. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, the courtroom itself seemed to exhale, the finality of the words settling like a lead weight on every pair of shoulders present. The air seemed thicker, heavier. Shane did not move. His face remained unreadable, though his fingers curled into a fist so tight that his nails pressed against the flesh of his palm. Across the room, Captain Lindstrom didn't so much as blink. He had expected nothing less. Mary's breath finally left her in a sharp, involuntary sob. The sound, though small, was deafening in the quiet. She pressed her fingers to her lips, her shoulders shaking. Tim shifted, his arm moving just slightly as though to reach for her, but he didn't. His gaze remained locked on his son. Judge Nolan let the silence settle before his voice, steady as ever, cut through it. "Have you reached a sentence?" Sergeant Bassey looked down at the final paper in his hands. "We have, Your Honor." Shane swallowed for the first time since the verdict had been read. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but his throat worked once before he set his jaw again. Sergeant Bassey's voice did not falter. "We, the jury, in unanimous agreement, recommend a sentence of 43 years in confinement, reduction in rank to E1, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge." A murmur rippled through the spectators, a mixture of quiet gasps and shifting bodies. Even those who had expected a harsh sentence could not help but react. Tim Alexander inhaled sharply, his fingers flexed as though he had been struck, his broad chest rising and falling in controlled, measured breaths, something to make sure he wouldn't hyperventilate. Mary shook her head slightly, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes. Shane did not move. His expression remained impassive, his posture stiff as ever. Judge Nolan's gaze remained on him for a moment before he gave a single nod. "So be it." Then, his voice hardened. "Security, remove the defendant." The courtroom erupted into movement. Mary let out a choked sob. Tim didn't move. His knuckles were white. The world had gone silent. The voices in the courtroom, the shuffling of feet, the hushed murmurs, the shifting of bodies, felt distant, like echoes bouncing through water. Shane still stood motionless. The handcuffs were cold, their weight unfamiliar yet absolute. They were no longer hypothetical, no longer a threat looming in the distance. They were real. clamped around his wrists, marking him not as a soldier, but as a prisoner. 43 years. The number might as well have been smashed against the inside of his skull. It felt impossible, a punishment so disproportionate it defied reason. 43 years. He'd be 65 before he saw the outside world again. An old man, his life wasted in a cell. No career, no redemption, just time. Endless, cruel time. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He had done his job, followed orders, and yet here he was, stripped of everything, his rank, his pay, his future, his very identity. Through the storm raging in his mind, he barely registered Judge Nolan speaking. The Brigadier General's voice remained firm, professional, detached, like he wasn't sending a man to rot behind bars, like he hadn't just erased Shane Alexander from the Army's books. Dishonorable discharge. That stung almost more than the prison sentence. He could stomach the time. Hell, soldiers were trained to endure, to push through pain, to suffer in silence. But the dishonorable discharge, that was a mark he could never erase. He'd spent his entire life wanting to be a soldier, dreaming of the uniform, of service, of purpose. He had given everything to the Army, bled for it, and in return, it had turned its back on him. Somewhere behind him, his mother was crying. Shane kept his gaze forward. Don't look back. If he looked at her, if he met his father's eyes, he might shatter. And right now, he needed to hold the line, the same way he had in the field, the same way he had in every mission, every goddamn moment leading up to this. He squared his shoulders, inhaled sharply, and continued to stare ahead, even if what lay behind those eyes was miles away from this God-forsaken place. His heart pounded, heavy and steady, like a drum in a march for the departed. The MPs flanked him now, one on either side. He could feel their presence, the shift of their boots on the courtroom floor. They weren't rough with him, but they didn't need to be. The cuffs did all the talking. Judge Nolan's voice rang out one final time. This court is dismissed. A murmur of movement swept through the room. Benches creaked, boots scuffed against polished tile. Somewhere, someone whispered. Shane caught snippets of words. 43 years. Dishonorable. Murderer. He forced himself to breathe. Murderer. His throat tightened, a flash of white-hot anger searing through him. He wasn't a murderer. The thought coiled inside him like a fist ready to swing. He wanted to shout, to throw the whole damn courtroom into chaos, wanted to grab the nearest officer and ram his head into the wall, demand to know how the hell they expected a soldier to do his job if they were going to call it murder afterward. He'd been trained for war, trained to act, to neutralize threats. That was the mission. That had always been the mission. But when the dust settled, when the bodies were counted, suddenly everyone wanted to pretend it was something else. Bullshit. He had done his duty. The rage burned in his chest, but it had nowhere to go. His hands were bound, his voice stolen by the weight of the verdict. He could scream, fight, demand justice, but it wouldn't matter. The decision had been made. Shane gritted his teeth as the MPs moved him forward. The courtroom blurred around him, but he kept his steps steady. Left, right. He wouldn't let them see him fumble, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He felt 100 of them shamelessly eyeballing him as he was led toward the side door. Some gazes were filled with pity, some with indifference, some with an odd kind of satisfaction. The kind one gets watching two people rip the third to shreds. And then there were the eyes he wouldn't look at, the ones that mattered most. His mother, his father. He was aware of his mother's shaking hands, knew his father's face was so stiff he'd probably forgotten to breathe. But he didn't turn. Couldn't. Because if he did, he might see the truth in their eyes, the silent heartbreak, the helplessness, the quiet understanding that their son, their soldier, was being taken from them, and he couldn't bear it. He'd been a soldier first, before anything else, and now they were stripping even that from him. The MPs finally guided him through the doorway, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him, sealing him off from the life he had known. The hallway was cold, dim. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the walls were a dull shade of beige that reminded him of barracks he would never see again. Shane swallowed hard. 43 years. God damn. His boots echoed against the linoleum as they led him down the hall. The weight of the cuffs bit into his wrists, constantly reminding him that he wasn't just walking. He was being taken, escorted, processed like an inmate. His breath came slow and steady, but inside his mind was anything but calm. What the hell had just happened? One moment he was a protector, someone who'd vowed to serve his country, to be the pillar his nation needed for the road to progress, a specialist in the United States Army. The next he was a convict, a no-good, treacherous criminal, a single reading, and just like that, everything he had built, everything he had given was gone. He thought of the men he had served with, the ones who knew what it was really like out there, the ones who wouldn't have hesitated to pull the trigger in his place. Would they have been convicted too? Or had he just been the unlucky bastard they decided to make an example of? He thought of his father, the quiet, steady man who had always been there, even when words failed them both. What was he supposed to say to him now? And his mother, his sweet, patient mother, who had always prayed for his safety. What had she prayed for today? Mercy, justice, a miracle? None had come. The MPs took a sharp left, guiding him toward a steel-barred holding cell at the end of the corridor. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through him. This was real. This was happening, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Shane inhaled sharply as they reached the cell. One of the MPs reached for his keys, the metal jingling as he unlocked the door. Shane took a slow breath, stepping forward when prompted. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the finality of the moment as the gate slid shut behind him. He stared at the gray walls, at the thin mattress bolted to the metal frame, at the tiny window set high in the concrete. 43 years. God help him.